So this is the default UI of Blender, and we are not going to use this UI. Instead, we are going to switch to the Sculpting UI. To do that, click on the plus icon on the top bar and then go to Sculpting and Sculpting. This adds a new UI for us, and this is the Sculpting UI. And at any given time, we can switch back and forth between the different UI. Now, once you're finished with the sculpting, you can simply right-click and delete the Sculpting UI. Okay, let's take a look at the Sculpting UI itself. And over here on the left-hand side, we have all the available brushes. And over here on the right, we also have the same list of brushes, but organized differently. Okay, and down here we have the settings for the brush and the sculpt mode itself. Now, one thing to notice is that Blender has switched to sculpt mode, and we can switch back to object mode by holding down Control Tab and then move your mouse cursor to the left and then release Control Tab. And we are now back to the object mode. And let's go to the modifier tab and add a subdivision surface modifier and subdivide the cube 5 times so that we have a little bit more geometry to work on. Okay, and hit apply. And let's go back to the sculpt mode. Hold down Control Tab and then move your mouse cursor down and release. Now we're back in the sculpt mode. Okay, let's take a look at the tools. The brushes. Click here and see all the different brushes. Now, some of these brushes are more useful than the others. So I'm going to cover the more useful brushes and ignore the rest for this tutorial. Okay, so the first brush that I'd like to talk about is the grab brush. Over here on the left hand side, it is the grab brush is the second from the top, and if you hover your cursor on it, we can see that the shortcut is G. Now notice that the grab brush, as well as some other brushes, actually has a small triangle to the bottom right corner. That means you can click and hold to open up a list of variations of that particular brush. And for example, the grab brush has 2 variations, the grab brush and the thumb brush. Now, and I find the thumb brush to be quite useless, and I don't really use it like ever. So let's switch back to the grab brush. Another way to switch between the variation of a brush is to press the hotkey multiple times. So for example, if I hit G again, it'll switch to the thumb brush, and if I hit G again, it will switch back to the grab brush. Okay, so let's take a look at the grab brush. Now this brush, what it does is that it simply moves whatever we click perpendicular to the view direction. Okay, so the angle at which you view your object is actually very important. And if you hold down Control and then move, the movement will be along the surface orientation instead of perpendicular to the view direction. Okay, so this is the 2 ways we can use the grab brush. The next brush is the Sculpt Draw brush. You can click here, and this is the Sculpt Draw brush. It is actually the first brush on the left hand side panel, and the hotkey is X. So hit X to activate the Sculpt Draw brush. And this is the most simple brush of Blender. It simply pushes the vertices up as we make the brush stroke. We can hold down Control to invert the brush effect. In this case, it will push the vertices down. Now the Control key only inverts the brushes, okay, and for the brushes that push up, the Control key will press down, and for the brushes that cut down into the surface, the Control key will invert it to make it push up instead. The next brush is the clay brush. Okay, this is the clay brush. The hotkey for the clay brush is C, and the clay brush is quite similar to the sculpt draw brush, but it feels a little bit better for some reason. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but it feels different from the sculpt draw brush. Now, but we are not going to use this clay brush very often. The real clay brush is the clay strip, which is a variation of the clay brush, and you can hit C one more time to switch to the clay strip brush. Now the clay strip brush is a special one, and let's increase the strength a little bit so that we can demonstrate what it does. The clay strip brush also pushes the surface up, or if we hit Control, it'll press the surface down. However, if we sculpt over a concave surface, the clay strip brush will fill in that concave area while leaving the rest untouched. So it is very easy to fill in a concave area and make a flat surface out of it. And in the case and if we hold down Control to invert the brush, we can then cut away the convex area and make them flat, like so. So this is a very useful brush to control the form precisely. Now if we use the sculpt draw brush and try to fill in a concave surface, it's going to be much harder, and it will take quite a lot of practice in order to get to fill in the area correctly. Next is the crease brush. The crease brush hotkey is Shift C. Now this brush cuts into the model and pulls the vertices around into the cut, like so. So you can easily create a very sharp cut along the on the surface, like so. One variation of the crease brush is the pinch brush. If we hit Shift C again, we switch to the pinch brush. Now the pinch brush does not cut into the surface, but it only pulls the vertices together. So we can use this crease brush to make very sharp edges, like this one. Alright. Now is a good time to talk about the smooth brush. The hotkey is S. However, nobody is going to use the S hotkey. Instead, with any brush selected, we just hold down Shift to temporarily switch to the smooth brush. For example, I can switch to the grab brush, and I can hold down Shift and then smooth out this little area here. And I can release the Shift key to switch back to the grab brush and then continue working. So yeah, this is a much better way to use the smooth brush instead of using the hotkey. Okay, next let's take a look at the settings for the brush itself. And here we have the radius, which is the size of the brush, and we can increase or decrease the size of the brush here, or we can use the hotkey F to change the size of the brush right in the viewport. And for the strength of the brush, we can use the hotkey Shift F and move in and out like so to set the strength for the brush. So for the grab brush, usually I set the strength to something around 0.55, and it just feels much better. Let's switch to the draw brush, and notice that we have these little icons next to the strength and the radius and the auto smooth. And this icon is about pen pressure, and currently pen pressure is active for the strength. That means if I press slightly, the brush effect will be very slight, and if I press down a little bit more heavy, the brush will be much stronger. Okay, and if I click that icon, I now turned off the pressure sensitive. That means it doesn't matter how heavy I press my brush, the brush strength will always be the same. And same goes for the radius. If I press slightly, the brush will be small, and if I press heavily, the brush will be much bigger. So this is a quick way to control the effect of the brush. So for me personally, I just turn off the sensitivity for the radius and turn on the sensitivity for the strength, which is the default setting. So let's smooth out these areas before moving on to the next section. Okay, let's take a look at the other settings that Blender has to offer. For now, we only need to pay attention to the stroke, curve, dynamic topology, and the symmetry lock sections. The stroke section lets us set the behavior of the stroke. Right now, the sculpt draw simply make a single brush stroke like this. However, we can change the way the stroke behave, and this is actually the space stroke method. We can actually change the stroke method to say anchor, and now the stroke behave like this. We simply project the shape of the brush onto the surface, and that's it. So for example, I can just smooth out this surface and then hold down Control and then project a circle dent onto the surface. And if I think it's not deep enough, I'll just project again. And now we have a very deep hole in the model. And maybe one more time. Okay. This is how you quickly project stuff onto your model. And we also have a bunch of different stroke methods, but those are beyond the scope of this tutorial. So for the time being, we're going to stick with space and anchored stroke method. So let's switch back to space and see what happened if we increase the spacing to something like 150%. We can see that the brush leaves a very sparse stroke, and let's decrease this to something lower and see what it does. We can see that the brush is much more continuous, and let's set it back to 10%. And we have a continuous stroke. Next, let's take a look at the smooth stroke option. Turn it on to smooth out our stroke. Now with the smooth stroke on, we can see that the stroke is delayed and smoothed out. And now let's try to shake up our brush stroke, and as you can see, the stroke is still very stable. So this is a good way to sculpt with high precision. Okay. You can play with the radius and the factor to change the smoothness of the stroke. Okay, let's turn off the smooth stroke and move on to the next section, the curve section. Okay, I think our model right now has too much details for us to experiment with the strokes. So let's hit F and set a fairly large brush and then hold down Shift and smooth out the entire model. Like so. Okay. Let's switch to anchored brush method. Now, let's take a look at the curves. This curve is basically the strength of the brush from the center towards the side of the brush stroke. And the left side is the center of the brush, and the right side is the edge of the brush. For now, if we project a brush stroke onto the model, we can see that we project a roundish looking brush. However, let's Ctrl Z to undo that. If we set the curve to something like this, we will project a very sharp, spiky looking brush, and we can actually get crazy with this curve and see what it does. Let's set something like this and project another brush stroke. This is how the curve dictates the shape of the brush. Let's switch back to the default curve and close the curve section. And let's Ctrl Z to undo that brush projection. Next, let's take a look at the Symmetry Lock section. And we will not touch the tiling topic for the time being. We are going to take a look at the mirror and the lock only. So right now, we can see that the mirror option is on. That means whatever we do on one side, it will be mirrored to the other side. Okay, something like so. And if we turn off the X mirror, we can then sculpt on one side at a time. Next, let's take a look at the lock. If we lock an axis, we can no longer move the vertices on that axis. For example, I now locked the x-axis and I can't move the vertices along the x-axis anymore. As you can see, the vertices only move on the y and the z-axis instead, so it gives us something like so. And if we lock the x and y axis at the same time, we can now only move the vertices up and down. Same thing for other tools. It doesn't matter how much we try to sculpt it, the vertices will only move up or down. Okay, let's turn off the lock. Next is the dynamic topology section. The hotkey to turn on this mode is Ctrl D, and as you can see, the dynamic topology is now on. And if we go to the Object tab and then go to Viewport Display and turn on the wireframe, we can see that the dynamic topology mode actually cut our mesh into triangles. This is okay since we no longer care about the mesh at this point. Now the dynamic topology, what it does is that it cut our mesh as we sculpt. Okay. And the size of the mesh that it cuts is defined by this number over here. Currently it is set to 12 pixels. That means when we sculpt, Blender will cut the mesh in such a way that the edges here are always roughly around 12 pixels. So that means if we zoom out, the mesh will be more sparse, and if we zoom in, we get much denser mesh. This allows us to sculpt very small details only where we need. Okay, something like that. However, not all the brushes actually cut the mesh. For example, the smooth brush does not cut the mesh, and the grab brush also does not cut the mesh. But the flatten brush does. So for example, I can flatten out this horn thing over here, and the Blender automatically cut the mesh to serve the brush stroke, like so. So with the dynamic topology on, we no longer care about the mesh structure, and we can just focus on sculpting the form and the features. We can actually change this detail size down to 6 pixels. That means there will be a lot more geometry for us to work on as we sculpt. Let's turn off the wireframe so that we can see the model a little bit better, and let's also turn off the grid and the axis. Now let's take another look at the dynamic topology. Here we have the refined method, we have subdivide and collapse. That means if we zoom in, the mesh will divide for us to serve more details, and if we move far away and sculpt, Blender will merge the edge together to get rid of the details. And if we don't want Blender to get rid of the details for us, we can switch to subdivide only, and now we can zoom in to sculpt some details and then go back out and continue sculpting without losing the details that you have created when you zoom in, like so. If you want to clean up your mesh, switch to collapse edge and start collapsing the mesh. Now one thing to notice is that the dynamic topology is not very precise and stable. Sometimes it produces artifacts, weird artifacts and floating vertices. So in that case, you have to click optimize down here to get rid of the mistake areas. Okay, that's enough with the boring stuff, so I'm gonna end the video here, and in the next video we are going to put our knowledge to good use and sculpt something nice. For warming up, we shall sculpt an apple, and then we shall step up the game and sculpt a pumpkin. Alright, I'll see you next time.